Is there a public, torn apart story? The 23rd of August, 1305. The sun had just risen over London when a bloody scene appeared in the middle of Smithfield Square. A bloodthirsty crowd gathered, shouting wildly as if they were watching a holy execution. In the center of the square, the instruments of torture blazed in the dawn light, dewy ropes, cold knives, and crackling flames that cheered in anticipation. And then, amid the chaotic screams, the guards dragged a tall, shaggy-haired man tied to a wooden fence. It was William Wallace, and in the next moment, he would be hung until he was barely alive, disemboweled while still alive, castrated, beheaded, and quartered, a death reserved for those considered traitors. But who was William Wallace? How did an ordinary Scottish knight become the greatest threat to the throne of England? To understand this terrible tragedy, we must go back in time, to the misty mountains of Scotland, where a noble boy grew up surrounded by legendary stories of freedom, honor, and loyalty of his people. History has gradually revealed the identity of that hero. Around 1270, in Elderslie, Renfrewshire, William Wallace was born into a middle-class family. His father, Malcolm Wallace, was a small landowner loyal to the Scottish crown. At the time, Scotland was an independent and prosperous kingdom under the leadership of King Alexander III, who was known for his moderate policies and stable relations with the neighboring Kingdom of England. However, everything changed abruptly in 1286 when Alexander died without a direct heir. The chosen successor was Margaret, a 3-year-old girl, often called the Norwegian Maiden because she lived at the Norwegian court. Unfortunately, Margaret died on her return journey to Scotland to assume the throne, leaving the throne vacant and causing a serious dispute among the nobles of the country. The two most powerful families, Balliol and Bruce, began to vie for power. When they could not reach agreement, the Scottish lords chose a dangerous option: to ask King Edward I of England to act as arbitrator. This was a pivotal and risky decision. Edward I, known as Longshanks because of his tall stature, was known for his expansionist ambitions and his toughness in governing. Realizing the chaos was an opportunity to expand his influence, he chose John Balliol as the new King of Scotland. But in return, Edward forced Balliol to recognize English kingship over Scotland, turning the once free country into a vassal state. Under Edward's control, Balliol was often ridiculed by his contemporaries as a weak monarch, nothing more than an empty cloak who tried to resist but failed. In 1296, he was deposed. Edward then launched a military campaign deep into Scotland, sacking towns, killing civilians, and carrying the Stone of Destiny, the sacred symbol of Scottish kingship, back to England as a trophy product. Scotland was now virtually wiped off the map as a sovereign nation. It was in this context of invasion that the little-known William Wallace began to emerge. In May 1297, a seemingly small incident became the spark that ignited a wave of rebellion. While Wallace was in the town of Lanark, an English official named William Heselrigg, who was then the sheriff, attempted to arrest him for disobeying the occupying authorities. During the clash, Heselrigg was killed. Some accounts claim that Wallace personally finished him off in a duel. This did not cause Wallace to hide or flee. Instead, he gathered his forces, returned to Lanark, and annihilated the entire English garrison there. From there, a wave of resistance began to spread throughout Scotland. Wallace quickly became a prominent leader in the resistance movement. What set him apart from other nobles was the cause he pursued. While many lords only fought rather than fighting for land or personal influence, Wallace had a vision for something greater than a completely free Scotland. It was this vision that inspired the most oppressed classes, farmers, artisans, and ordinary people who had suffered the brunt of English rule. Can you imagine that? A man, without noble birth, without a mighty army, but lighting a ray of hope for an entire nation that was being trampled. In the summer of 1297, William Wallace set out on a journey across Scotland to rally support from the people. Initially a small band, his army quickly grew to thousands. Wallace led attacks on isolated English outposts, recaptured castles, and most importantly, revived the fading hopes of a nation once proud of its independence. On the other side, King Edward I of England underestimated the seriousness of the rebellion. He assigned the Earl of Surrey, John de Verne, the task of quelling the movement with an army of some 20,000 men, including professional soldiers, armoured knights, and archers from Wales. For Surrey, this seemed like a simple task of eliminating a group of poorly trained rebels. On the 11th of September of that year, the two sides faced off at a strategic point. Stirling Bridge, a narrow bridge spanning the River Forth, the lifeline between the Highlands and Lowlands of Scotland. Confident in his superior strength, Surrey ordered a frontal assault across the bridge. But he made a fatal mistake. Wallace, who had chosen the terrain with keen strategic vision, waited until only a portion of the English army had crossed. As the enemy split between the two banks, Wallace gave the order. The Scottish army poured down from the hillsides in a torrent, cutting off the English retreat and preventing reinforcements from reaching the rear. The battle quickly turned into a massacre. With no room to maneuver, the English knights were cut down in groups. Among the dead was Hugh de Cressingham, the crown's treasurer in Scotland and the most hated man in the land. According to legend, he was skinned, and Wallace is said to have used the skin to make a sword belt. The Earl of Surrey fled in the chaos, leaving thousands of his men dead. And once again the miracle happened. The victory at Stirling Bridge was not simply a victory, but a symbolic event, a miracle that reborn the national pride of the Scottish people. A small force with modest numbers had done the impossible, defeated the most powerful army of the time from the Kingdom of England. As the news spread across the European continent, Wallace's reputation spread far and wide, and he was hailed as a protector of his country. Foreign kings began to regard him as an equal, not just a resistance leader, but a true statesman. However, for King Edward I of England, the defeat was an intolerable humiliation. The defeat at Stirling had ignited a fierce anger in him. Edward vowed to return to Scotland with an army so overwhelming that any resistance would be extinguished before it even began. In 1298, he led the largest army he had ever assembled, around 30,000 men, including elite cavalry and thousands of skilled Welsh archers. On the 22nd of July, the two armies faced off on the Falkirk plain, an ideal terrain for the English cavalry to exploit. Knowing that he could not use the old strategy, Wallace organized his army in a circular formation, or schiltron, which consisted of spearmen standing upright in a defensive circle like a mobile wall of spikes. He also scattered his archers among these formations. The English cavalry's initial charge was stopped by sharp spears, piercing both horse and rider. At first glance, it seemed that Wallace was about to repeat his resounding victory. But when the Welsh archers entered the battle, the tide turned completely. A heavy rain of arrows rained down on the Scottish defenders, who were almost completely unarmored. The formation that had been able to withstand cavalry now became a dead end. Wallace tried to organize a retreat, but it was too late. Thousands of his men fell at Falkirk, including many of his most seasoned men. After this defeat, Wallace retreated into the mountains. While other Scottish lords sought to negotiate with the English, he continued to fight back using guerrilla tactics. For 7 years, he quietly attacked English units, freeing prisoners and keeping the flames of resistance alive. Though he had made the English army tremble on the battlefield, William Wallace could not hide from the shadow of the Empire forever. Edward I, who was so vengeful that he was blinded by hatred, knew that if Wallace lived, the fire of resistance in Scotland would never be extinguished. The king not only offered a huge reward for his capture, but also sent spies across the continent as if he were hunting a monster that needed to be exterminated. By 1305, the net of betrayal had finally tightened. Sir John Menteith, a Scottish nobleman who had been turned against power and wealth, betrayed Wallace to his enemies. A secret handshake with the English was enough to seal the fate of the national hero. Wallace was captured near Glasgow, not in a glorious battle, but in the shadow of betrayal. The price of freedom this time was the silence of justice. In London, the ruling class cheered as if they had hunted a beast. Edward I had finally caught who had humiliated him, who had turned England's victory into humiliation. But the king did not want Wallace dead. He wanted him crushed, stripped, and made a bloody lesson for anyone who dared to hold his head high. On the 23rd of August of that year, Wallace was brought to Westminster Hall. He was charged with treason, murder, and blasphemy against the sacred authority of the crown. But he would not bow. Before the judge, Wallace coldly denied all charges, stating bluntly that he had never sworn allegiance to the English king and therefore could not be considered a traitor. His words were like knives, cutting deep into the pride of the powerful. His bluntness did not save his life, but it made the sentence all the more brutal. He was sentenced to death in the most gruesome manner the court could think of. Drawn, hanged, eviscerated, castrated, beheaded, and quartered. A bloody symphony composed to oppress the soul of an entire people clan. Thousands poured into Smithfield that morning, as if to witness a bloody ritual. Wallace was tied to a wooden plank, dragged through the streets of sharp stones, his flesh torn to shreds. At the execution site, he was suspended, suffocated until he was almost dead, then lowered, still alive. And then began a torture not meant for any living creature. His body was ripped open from the belly, his intestines pulled out and thrown into a fire, burned before his eyes. The blood flowed, but the pain did not stop. He was castrated, cut into pieces, as if his body were a symbol to be erased from the collective memory. Finally, his head was cut off, ending a suffering that no soul should have to endure. His body was quartered, each piece sent to the great cities to be hung as a warning in flesh and blood. His head was placed on London Bridge, an anonymous head that now became a symbol of fear and a dynasty trembling before the spirit they could not destroy. William Wallace was resurrected in the desire for freedom of the weak and in the very mistake that Edward made. Edward I's greatest mistake was not on the battlefield, but when he chose to use violence to extinguish an indomitable spirit. William Wallace's terrible death, carried out publicly as a warning, did not make the Scots bow their heads. On the contrary, he inadvertently created an immortal banner of courage. Wallace, in his final moments, did not vanish, but turned into a fire that burned slowly in the hearts of the whole nation. Less than a year later, that fire flared up fiercely. Robert Bruce, a man of Scottish royal blood, slew John Comyn in a sacred place and claimed the throne for the rightful cause. From then on, the fight for the homeland was reborn, not only by swords, but by the sacred memory of a man who had not bowed to death. Edward I, who had terrified all of Europe, died in 1307 while conducting a final campaign to crush Scotland's will for independence. But he took with him to the grave only an unfulfilled dream. Wallace left no throne, no castle, no territory. What he left was an intangible but eternal legacy, the belief that liberty was worth more than life. More than 7 centuries have passed, but his name still echoes in every prayer for independence. And in his most painful moment, he was immortalized not as a lone martyr, but as the sacred symbol of an unyielding people.